The minus sign sits there on the hospital form, tiny and unremarkable. A single dash after the letters RH. Most people barely glance at it. But that minus sign means your red blood cells are missing a protein called the RHD antigen, one deleted gene on chromosome 1. And if you carry that deletion, you are part of a biological pattern that reaches back more than 15,000 years, straight into the deepest ice age Europe ever endured, and into a mountain refuge where one of the most isolated human populations on the continent still lives today. Worldwide, about 6 to 7% of people are Rh negative. In Europe, that number rises to roughly 15%. But in one small corner of the Western Pyrenees, straddling the border between Spain and France, the frequency of Rh-negative blood hits 25 to 35%. That is the highest concentration on Earth. And the people who carry it speak a language unrelated to any other language on the planet. Sit with that number for a second. 1 in 3. Now ask yourself what could possibly produce a genetic quirk that concentrated so intensely in one place, in one people, while remaining rare almost everywhere else. The answer, it turns out, rewrites the entire early history of Europe. And it was buried not just in blood banks, but in ancient bones pulled from a cave in northern Spain, in mitochondrial lineages that refused to be replaced, and in a massive Bronze Age migration that reshaped every corner of the continent except for one. That minus sign is not a medical footnote. It is a signature. And the story of how it got there is not the story you learned in any textbook. For most of the 20th century, the textbook version of European origins ran something like this. Agriculture spread from the Middle East into Europe around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, carried by migrating farmers who gradually replaced the scattered hunter-gatherer bands they encountered. Then, much later, Indo-European languages swept across the continent, probably on horseback, probably from the steppes north of the Black Sea, bringing the linguistic ancestors of everything from English to Greek to Sanskrit. Under that framework, the Basques were a puzzle. Their language, Euskara, shares no ancestry with any Indo-European tongue. It is a language isolate, the only one in Western Europe, spoken today by roughly 750,000 people in the Basque country. The assumption was that the Basques must be a relic, a leftover from some earlier linguistic layer, perhaps the last speakers of whatever languages Europe spoke before the Indo-Europeans arrived. But the assumption was also that they were basically just another European group who happened to hang on to an old language, genetically mixed and blended like everyone else. It sounded clean. It sounded complete. But real history almost never behaves like a tidy paragraph. And then the ancient DNA revolution began, and the bones started talking. In 2015, a research team led by Torsten Günther at Uppsala University published a study in the journal PNAS that cracked the story open. The team had sequenced the genomes of 8 individuals buried in the El Portalón cave at Atapuerca in northern Spain. These people lived between 3,500 and 5,500 years ago, spanning the Chalcolithic and Bronze Age periods. The researchers then compared those ancient genomes to modern European populations, running the data through statistical models designed to measure genetic affinity. The result was immediate and striking. One modern population clustered more closely with those ancient Iberian farmers than any other group in Europe today. It was not the modern Spanish. It was not the modern French. It was the Basques. The genetic signal was clear enough to make a claim that, at the time, sounded almost impossible. The Basques descended directly from early Iberian farmers who had mixed with local Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and that ancestry had been preserved in them across thousands of years with remarkably little outside intrusion. Let that sink in. While the rest of Europe was churned and reshaped by wave after wave of newcomers, the ancestors of the Basques were already there, already settled, already mixing their farmer and hunter-gatherer lineages into a stable population that would persist essentially in place. But the Günther paper pointed to something even more specific, something that would force a complete rethinking of what the Bronze Age actually did to Europe. The massive steppe migration, the Yamnaya expansion, that swept out of the Pontic steppe around 4,500 to 5,000 years ago, and fundamentally altered the genetic landscape of the continent, largely bypassed the Basques. Not slightly bypassed them, largely bypassed them. And that single observation moved the Basque story from a curious footnote to a central plot point in the peopling of Europe. Now try to imagine standing somewhere in the Western Pyrenees 5,000 years ago. Behind you, rising in ridges of limestone and oak, the mountains that would become the modern border between two nations. Ahead of you, the coastal plain dropping toward the Bay of Biscay. You are living in a world that is already old. The great ice sheets that once pressed down from the north have been gone for millennia. Your ancestors sheltered here when most of Europe was uninhabitable, crammed into a narrow strip of land that archaeologists call the Franco-Cantabrian Refuge. That refuge ran along the northern coast of Spain and into what is now southwestern France. And it was one of the few places in Europe where humans could survive the last glacial maximum between roughly 26,000 and 19,000 years ago. When the ice finally retreated, many of those southern survivors expanded northward to repopulate the continent. But your ancestors stayed roughly in place. They painted caves. They buried their dead in the hills. They passed down a language whose origins no one can trace. And they carried, in their blood, a deletion on chromosome 1 that would eventually become the highest frequency Rh-negative cluster on the planet. That is the sensory zoom. And the data would eventually confirm exactly how old that continuity really was. In 2012, a team led by Duran Behar published a study in PLOS Genetics that looked specifically at mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line passed from mother to daughter across generations. They analyzed Basque mitochondrial haplogroups, particularly variants H1 and H3, and found something remarkable. The maternal lineages showed continuity going back to Paleolithic times, at least 15 to 20,000 years. That is not a metaphor. That is not a broad generalization. The female line ancestry of the Basques reaches straight back into the Franco-Cantabrian Refuge, unbroken, across the entire span of time that separates the last ice age from a modern hospital maternity ward. The maternal foundations of this population were laid before agriculture, before metalworking, before the wheel, and they survived everything that came after. But the maternal story was only half the picture. The male lineages would tell an equally surprising tale, and one that initially seemed contradictory. Basque men carry the Y chromosome haplogroup R1b-M269 at extremely high frequency, somewhere around 87 to 91%. That number, at first glance, looks like a smoking gun for steppe ancestry, because R1b is the classic Y chromosome lineage associated with the Yamnaya expansion across Europe. If Basque men were overwhelmingly R1b, surely they had been swamped by steppe migrants just like everyone else. But the specific subclade told a different story. Basque R1b is predominantly R1b DF27, a branch that is largely absent outside Iberia. This suggested a local Iberian expansion of R1b that happened before, or at least independently of, the broader steppe-driven wave that transformed the rest of the continent. More recent work by Vanessa Villalba Muco and colleagues in 2023 refined this picture further, suggesting that some of the R1b DF27 in Basques may still reflect a version of steppe admixture that arrived and then evolved locally, rather than representing a clean pre-steppe relic. But the broader pattern held. The Basques carried a version of R1b that was distinctively Iberian, one that diverged from the mainstream European R1b branches. If everything so far surprised you, the next finding turns the whole thing over. In 2019, a team led by Íñigo Olalde published a massive study in the journal Science that analyzed the genomes of 271 ancient Iberians spanning the past 8,000 years. This was not a small cave study. This was a systematic, large-scale reconstruction of the entire genomic history of the Iberian Peninsula. And what it revealed about the Bronze Age transformation was staggering. After roughly 4,500 years ago, about 40% of the male lineages in Iberia were replaced by Y chromosomes carrying steppe ancestry. 40%. In a single pulse of migration and mixture, nearly half the paternal lines on the peninsula were swept aside and replaced. That is not gradual change. That is demographic turnover on a scale that would have been visible within a few human generations. But here is the crucial detail buried in the Olalde data. The Basques kept much less of that replacement. While most modern Iberians carry steppe ancestry in the range of 40 to 50%, the Basques hold significantly lower levels. The Pyrenees Mountains provided a physical barrier that blunted the demographic wave. Not a wall, not an impenetrable fortress, but enough of a buffer that the older genetic substrate survived at higher frequencies than anywhere else in Western Europe. Read that number again. 40% replacement in most Iberian male lines, significantly less in the Basques. Think about what that implies for identity and continuity. A person living in what is now Madrid or Barcelona today descends, in large part, from newcomers who arrived on horseback 5,000 years ago. A person living in Bilbao or San Sebastian descends, to a much greater degree, from the people who were already there when the newcomers arrived. That is not a cultural claim. That is a genetic measurement. And the measurement says that the Basques are the closest living approximation of what pre-Indo-European Europe looked like, genetically speaking, that we have anywhere on the continent. The Bergstrom team, publishing in Science in 2020, confirmed the pattern from another angle. When you break European ancestry into its three main ancient components, early European farmers who brought agriculture from Anatolia, Western hunter-gatherers who had roamed the continent since the Paleolithic, and Yamnaya steppe pastoralists who arrived in the Bronze Age, the Basques stand out. They preserve unusually high proportions of early European farmer and Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, and lower Yamnaya ancestry than any other Western European population. They are not a pure preservation of any single ancient group. No living population is. But the mixture in their genomes is tilted in a direction that no other European group can match. The steppe wave that rewrote the genetic map of the continent left a blank space, and that blank space is roughly the shape of the Basque country. And here is where the story turns, because the blood evidence was pointing to exactly the same conclusion long before anyone had sequenced an ancient genome. The Rh blood group system was discovered in 1937 by Karl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener, the same Landsteiner who had earlier discovered the ABO blood groups. They were working with rhesus macaque monkeys, hence the name Rh. And they identified an antigen on the surface of red blood cells that most people carry, but some do not. The presence or absence of that antigen is controlled by the RhD gene on chromosome 1. A deletion of that gene produces the Rh negative type. From the moment the first population surveys were done, the Basque numbers jumped off the page. Across most of the world, Ra negative frequency hovers in the single digits. In Europe, it averages about 15%. In the Basques, it hits 25 to 35%, the highest frequency recorded anywhere on the planet. The question of how that happened has driven decades of debate, and the ancient DNA now offers a plausible framework. The Rh negative variant was already elevated in pre-Neolithic European hunter-gatherers. During the last glacial maximum, populations carrying that variant sheltered in the Franco-Cantabrian refuge. When the ice retreated and most of Europe was recolonized from multiple refuges, the Basques stayed put, and the Rh negative frequency drifted upward through founder effect and isolation. The steppe migrations that swept across Europe and diluted older variants everywhere else largely bypassed this pocket of the Pyrenees. So the minus sign on the hospital form is not just a random mutation, it is a fossil of pre-Indo-European Europe, preserved in living circulation because the population that carried it never got fully absorbed into the waves of change that washed over everyone around them. Stop and think about what that actually means. When a Basque person today donates blood and the lab types it as Rh negative, they are seeing a biological signature that their ancestors already carried when the cave painters of Altamira were putting bison and horses onto stone walls 36,000 years ago. Altamira sits in Cantabria, just west of the Basque country, and it represents one of the oldest continuous artistic traditions anywhere on Earth. Those paintings were made by people who were part of the same Franco-Cantabrian world that the Basque ancestors inhabited. The artistic impulse, the deep cultural continuity, the genetic isolation, and the blood type all converge on the same narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. If your family carries roots from the Basque country, the specific mixture in your DNA right now reflects a history unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. You carry, in proportions that science can now measure, the genetic legacy of people who watched the ice advance and retreat, who farmed the same valleys for millennia, who spoke a language whose origins no linguist can trace, and who were already ancient when the Indo-European expansion began. This is not just about correcting a history book. It reaches into living identities, into the way a person understands who they are and where they come from. And the language, Euskara, is the final piece that makes the whole picture cohere. If you are feeling a strange mix of anger and awe right now, you are not alone. There is no other language in Western Europe like Euskara. It is an isolate, meaning it has no demonstrated genealogical relationship to any other known language family. Not Indo-European, not Uralic, not anything. When linguists try to trace its ancestry, the trail goes cold somewhere in prehistory, presumably connecting to whatever languages were spoken in Western Europe before the spread of Indo-European tongues roughly 4,500 years ago. The linguistic evidence dovetails with the genetic data in a way that is rarely this clean. The genes say the Basques preserved pre-Indo-European ancestry at unusually high levels. The language says the same thing. The modern speaker count of roughly 750,000 people, scattered across 7 provinces on both sides of the Spain-France border, represents the last living echo of a linguistic landscape that was utterly erased everywhere else. Some researchers have proposed connections between Euskara and the extinct Iberian language of eastern Spain, or with ancient Aquitanian inscriptions found in southwestern France. These proposals remain debated and unproven. Attempts to link Euskara to Caucasian languages or other far-flung isolates have generally failed to convince the linguistic community. The honest answer is that Euskara's origins are genuinely unknown, but the fact of its survival, surrounded on all sides by Indo-European languages, is itself extraordinary. The Basque numerals use a base 20 counting system, vigesimal, unlike any surrounding language. Their folk traditions preserve pre-Christian symbols like the Laubaru cross and the earth goddess Mari, which some anthropologists link to pre-Indo-European belief systems. These are not proofs in the scientific sense. They are suggestive fragments, cultural parallels to the genetic pattern, hints that the Basque preservation of older elements extended beyond biology into language and custom. And that preservation took place under extraordinary historical pressure. The Basque country has been a political crossroads for millennia, caught between larger powers, absorbed into the Roman Empire, later into the kingdoms of Castile and France, and in the 20th century subjected to brutal suppression under the Franco dictatorship. The survival of Basque identity through all of that is not a passive accident of geography. It is an active, ongoing assertion of distinctness by a population that, as the genetics now show, really is measurably distinct in ancestry from the populations that surround them. The genetic story validates something Basque nationalists and cultural defenders have argued for generations. They are not just stubbornly holding on to an old language and old traditions out of sentiment. They are the living continuation of a population that has been in place since before the Indo-European languages existed, since before the Bronze Age, since before the ice sheets melted. If the story stopped here, it would already be powerful enough on its own. But ancient DNA had one more secret waiting, and it connects the Basque story to something much bigger than a single mountain region. The Franco-Cantabrian refuge was not just the cradle of the Basques. It was the reservoir from which much of Western Europe was repopulated after the last glacial maximum. When the ice retreated beginning around 19,000 years ago, the human groups that had sheltered in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans expanded northward. They carried their genes, their technologies, and presumably their languages into the newly habitable landscapes of France, the British Isles, and Scandinavia. The genetic imprint of that expansion is still detectable across Western Europe today, but in most places, it was later overwritten by the Neolithic farmer migrations, and then the Bronze Age steppe expansion. The Basques, by staying in the refuge zone, preserved a higher fidelity version of that original post-glacial genetic signal. This means that when geneticists study modern Basques, they are not just studying the history of one small ethnic group. They are studying a living window into a phase of European prehistory that is otherwise accessible only through ancient bones. The Rh-negative frequency, the mitochondrial continuity, the reduced steppe ancestry, and the language isolate all point to the same conclusion. The Basques approximate what large parts of Western Europe looked like genetically before the Bronze Age, in a way that no other living population does. Read that again, the closest living proxy for pre-Indo-European Western Europe. Not a perfect replica, not a time capsule unchanged, but a proxy close enough that studying Basque genomes helps scientists understand what was erased everywhere else. Now take the long view. Picture the entire sweep of European genetic history as a series of waves. The first wave, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, spread across the continent and then retreated into southern refuges during the Ice Age. The second wave, early European farmers from Anatolia, brought agriculture and mixed heavily with the hunter-gatherer groups they encountered. The third wave, the Yamnaya pastoralists from the steppe, swept across the continent in the Bronze Age and reshaped the genetic and linguistic landscape more profoundly than any event since the ice retreated. After that third wave, most of Europe carried some mixture of all three ancestries, but the proportions varied widely by region. In most places, the Yamnaya component was substantial. In the Basque country, it was not. The isolation of the Pyrenees was not absolute. Some steppe genes did enter Basque lineages, The Y chromosome data shows that clearly. But the level of intrusion was lower, and the older components held on more firmly. The result is a population that, when plotted on a genetic principal component analysis, sits slightly apart from other Western Europeans, tugged in the direction of the ancient farmers and hunter-gatherers, whose descendants elsewhere were more thoroughly diluted. This is not about Basque exceptionalism in any mystical sense. It is about geography, chance, and a specific sequence of demographic events. But the outcome is exceptional regardless of the cause. And the outcome has modern implications that extend far beyond academic journals. The Basque genetic distinctiveness has implications for medical research. The elevated Rh-negative frequency is just one example. Other genetic variants that are rare elsewhere reach higher frequencies in the Basque population, some of which may carry implications for disease susceptibility or resistance. The fact that the Basques represent a relatively isolated genetic cluster within Europe makes them valuable for studies that try to untangle the genetic basis of complex traits. The same isolation that preserved the old ancestry also created a population structure that geneticists can now use as a natural experiment. Leave one word in the comments capturing how this makes you feel. Just one word. But the honest caveats matter here, and science is most powerful when it is clear about what it does not prove. The claim that the Basques are the oldest Europeans is an oversimplification. Basque ancestry is a specific mix of very old European ancestries, preserved in unusually high proportions, not a pure survival of some original European population that existed before everyone else. Some steppe ancestry did enter Basque lineages. The Y chromosome evidence, even with the local DF27 subclade, does not entirely escape the steppe signature. The Rh-negative frequency link to Basque origins is real and well documented, but the mechanism that drove it to such high levels is still debated. Genetic drift in a small, isolated population is a plausible explanation. Selection for some unknown advantage of the Rh-negative type is another possibility. Or it could be a combination of both. The linguistic origin of Euskara is genuinely unknown, and attempts to connect it to other languages remain speculative. The connections some have drawn to Iberian, Aquitanian, or Caucasian languages are interesting hypotheses, not established facts. This is not a weakness in science. It is science being honest about what it can and cannot claim. The genetic evidence for Basque continuity is strong and multiply replicated. The cultural and linguistic evidence is suggestive and consistent. But the full story of how the pieces fit together is still being written. And the most exciting part is that the writing is happening right now, in real time, as new ancient genomes are sequenced and new analytical methods are developed. Now return to that minus sign, the one on the hospital form. Picture a Basque woman in a clinic in Bilbao, giving blood. The tech types her sample, Rh-negative. That little dash on the chart is the end product of an unbroken chain of inheritance that runs back through the Franco regime's suppression of Basque identity, back through the medieval kingdom of Navarre, back through the Roman observers who noted a strange language in the Pyrenees, back through the Bronze Age newcomers who stopped at the mountain passes, back through the Neolithic farmers who settled the valleys, back through the Ice Age hunters who painted bison on cave walls, back through the last glacial maximum when a handful of human beings huddled in a refuge between the ice and the sea and passed a deleted gene on chromosome 1 to their children. Every Rh-negative Basque today carries that history in their bloodstream. The minus sign is not a medical footnote. It is a signature of pre-Indo-European Europe, still circulating, still alive, still part of the human story. If you carry Rh-negative blood, some version of this history is sitting in your genome right now. Even if you are not Basque, even if you live thousands of miles from the Pyrenees, the elevated Rh-negative frequencies across Europe trace back to the same refuge populations, the same Ice Age survival, the same ancient genetic patterns that the Basques preserved at the highest levels. Your blood type connects you to a chapter of human history that was written long before any written record, and that science is only now learning to read. The textbooks are still catching up. The neat story of European origins, the one with clean waves of farmers and warriors replacing everything in their path, turned out to be not slightly incomplete. It was structurally wrong. Replacement happened, yes, and on a massive scale. But it was never total. The Pyrenees held a pocket of older Europe, and that pocket survived. The DNA did not lie, it waited. And now, in the genomes of a few 100,000 people speaking a language without relatives, in the blood types of 1 in 3 locals in a Basque clinic, in the bones pulled from a cave in Atapuerca, and the mitochondrial lineages dated to Paleolithic times, the oldest mystery in Europe has finally been solved. Not by a single study, not by a single dramatic breakthrough, but by the slow, patient accumulation of data, year after year, paper after paper, gene after gene, until the picture became undeniable. The Basques were never who we thought. They were something older, and the minus sign proves it. Subscribe. We go this deep every time, past the comfortable version of the story, and into what the DNA actually shows.